Hello and welcome to the program. Without the withdrawal of forces in the Donbas, the Normandy format meeting will not take place. This was stated by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the press marathon in Kyiv. Earlier, he said that Ukraine should control its border with Russia and Peacekeepers' deployment to Donbas is a possible option for achieving this goal. Belarusian President Lukashenko said in late September that Minsk was ready to send peacekeepers to Donbas for monitoring a section of the Russian-Ukrainian border. To discuss this and more, we're joined in studio today by Ilya Ponomarev, former Russian MP. Thank you. And
thanks for having me.
First, let's discuss the hot topic for Ukraine, the famous Steinmeier formula.
Famous or ill-famous?
Or infamous, let's say. As far as I know, if you've said that this so-called Steinmeier formula is a bad idea. Could you expand on that?
I think it's in general a very bad idea to run elections on the territory which was not pacified yet. And if one would talk to Steinmeier, he can remind him that the first elections in Republic of Germany after World War II was held in 1949, 4 years after the end of war. And that was for a reason, not because Germans were not ready for democracy or whatever, but because the country was in ruins and whatever opinion would be expressed on truly free elections would not be objective meaning. You know, that would be very much affected by low quality of life, by the desire of revenge, by the feelings of frustration, and by numerous refugees and temporary displaced persons which would be relocated in different parts of country and could not return to their homes. And exactly the same situation is in Donbas. We have 2 million displaced people in Donbas, which is like half of population that lives there. We have totally destroyed industry. We have a lot of jobless and homeless people. We have foreign military presence, so you name it. So first, this territory has to be restored. First, investment should come in. First, you should restore the industry and give people jobs, and give people pensions, and give people subsidies, and give people all the social warranties that they deserve. Then you can call them to the polling stations to learn their opinion about the political life.
So you would defend the idea that these wounds have to be closed before any kind of elections can happen, but it could take years. It could take 10 years.
Oh, hopefully that would not take 10 years, but 5 years very much possible. This war already pens for 5 years, so surely it has to be a comparable period. And it doesn't really matter who would actually win the elections. You know, some people debate, we will run the elections, and obviously that would be separatists who would win the elections. So other people say, we will run the elections, and because it was Zelensky who would bring peace on this territory, Zelensky would win the elections. Actually, it doesn't matter who would actually win the elections. What matters is that those elections would not be fair and free.
Now, that's for the Steinmeier formula, but I want to focus a little bit about the attitude of President of Belarus, Lukashenko, who said that Belarus is ready to deploy a peacekeeping mission in Donbas and take control of section of the Ukrainian-Russian border, which is now beyond the control of the Ukrainian government. How do you see the current role of Belarus and the figure of Lukashenko here?
Well, President Lukashenko's position is, I think, very much understandable. I think that he is facing a potential threat of annexation on behalf of Russia, and he does want to avoid this. And to achieve this, he needs to be important for the international community. So he tries to be the central mediator within this conflict. And we know that the Minsk agreements, they were signed in Minsk.
By definition.
So that already actually returned Lukashenko from the political oblivion that he was facing himself, you know, being isolated and branded as the last dictator of Europe. After Russia started his military campaign against Ukraine, Lukashenko moved to the position second to last, and then became this convenient mediator within the conflict. So he needs to keep this position. That's why he is offering his help and his assistance with the peacekeepers. Most likely this offer would never be accepted by Ukraine because Belarus is still very much dependent on Russia. But nevertheless, that would keep him in the spotlight.
Does the fact that Belarus is not the most democratic regime, to say the least, does it undermine his status as a negotiator, or it's not really important here?
No. I think that Belarus is really part of the process, and Lukashenko can help a lot. Really can help a lot Ukraine being a mediator with Putin, even on the personal basis. Putin doesn't like Lukashenko that much, but because of all these other considerations that he has, they're meeting regularly. He listens to him. They have normal communication, and he's a kind of convenient evil for Kremlin. So that's why people like Lukashenko from one side, or Erdogan from another side, or Netanyahu from the third side, they all can be used as a channel of communications between Kyiv and Moscow.
Now, let's also continue about Lukashenko. He said at the Minsk Dialogue Forum on Tuesday that the war is not just in Ukraine, there is a war in our home, and the problem must be solved by us. Is there a real threat? You talked about the possible annexation. Does Lukashenko really perceive Russia as a real threat? And is this threat possible?
I think this is an obvious threat. I wouldn't say that it's already for granted, and the decision to go after Belarus is taken in Kremlin. I don't think so, but I think that's one of the options on the table. Is in the future transit of power in Moscow, and I think that's the top topic on the agenda of all Kremlin people right now. I think that merging with Belarus, more like annexing Belarus, obviously, is one of the possibilities, and Lukashenko cannot ignore it. So I think that Lukashenko would like actually to have a real union between Belarus and Russia, and even maybe to run as a president of the combined two countries. And he has actually quite high chances of winning, but that's also been recognized in the Kremlin, and that's why they want to remove him from power. So it's a personal threat for Lukashenko.
Now, he also said that Russia and Ukraine are main side in the war in Donbas, and Ukraine's settlement of the conflict is possible only through closer negotiation between Kyiv and Moscow. He also believes that it will be impossible to resolve the conflict in Ukraine without the participation of the US. Which brings me to my next question. When we have, let's say, an ally like the US or Trump's USA recently, who recently, let's say, turned his back, to say the least, to the Kurds and leaving them to Turkey. Is that really a good idea to have, knowing the turmoil in domestic policy in the US and knowing what happened with the Kurds, to have such, let's say, in bracket, ally into this negotiation of the Minsk agreement?
No, I think that international politics, at the end of the day, that's always not about principles, but about interests. But I think that current interests of the United States are aligned with the interests of Ukraine. And I think that United States, they really don't want any of nations to start domination in the European continent, whether that's Russia or Germany or France. United States are interested in balance those centers of influence. In this sense, to support Ukraine right now, it's part of their normal and understandable strategy. Whether there would be Republicans at helm or whether there would be Democrats, I think that the policies would more or less remain the same. And in Europe, those similar considerations, they are heavily offset with the economic interests and with the investments that, say, German businesses have done in Russia and the amount of trade, etc. United States doesn't have those limitations. They don't have those considerations. Moreover, United States can become a major investor in Ukraine, especially in sectors like energy, in the sectors like agriculture, trade, and others. And that's why I think that we should work with Trump. I think that we should be careful to avoid the current scandal that erupted in Washington in relation to Vice President Biden. Ukraine should not be involved inside, as President Zelensky correctly has said, but with a skillful navigation, United States would remain key ally.
Which brings me to my next question: what could be a skillful navigation here from President Zelensky?
I think so. You know, why not? What would restrict him from doing this? There are a lot of carefully and well-established international legal procedures. So does the story with Biden deserves good investigation? I think it does. I think there are grounds to think there could have been wrongdoing in this situation, but we shouldn't take it for granted. So there is a legal procedure. Let Mr. Barr, Attorney General of the United States, write the official request for legal assistance to Mr. Rybashapko, the Attorney General of Ukraine, and it would be investigated in Ukraine properly. How it should be done. It should not be done in the phone calls. It should not be speculation when Democrats say, no, you don't do it, and the current Republican administration say, no, you do it. You know, there is a procedure. Let's follow the procedure. It's as simple as that, and everything would be done.
It's interesting that you raised the issues of the phone call, because Volodymyr Zelensky has a pretty clear view on that, is that the transcript or the phone calls shouldn't be revealed. In the meantime, it kind of undermines the idea of certain transparency that he revendicates, that he assumes we talked about during his campaign. What's your take on this contradiction in some ways?
No, I think that, of course, intergovernment communications and even many communications within the government of one country, of one nation, should be confidential. Otherwise, it's impossible to take decisions. You know, when you made the decision is always to be public. When you are just negotiating the decision, the negotiation process should be confidential, because otherwise you will not be able to reach a certain compromise, and politics is always about compromising different positions between each other. The question is, when somebody suspects, and I have a strong ground to suspect, there was a crime that was discussed. Of course, you know, there are procedures, and such revelation can take place. And that's actually what happened with this particular phone call. It was bad that it was published. It hurt the reputation of the United States. It hurt the reputation of Ukraine. It hurt the reputation of European Union, which was mentioned also during the conversation. It didn't do any good. And I think the Democrats in the House, they should understand that it actually hurt national security of the United States and the reputation of the United States by pursuing their own political goals. And now, when the whole transcript is published, it's very much visible that there was no wrongdoing, there was no crime discussed. So actually, they just hurt the reputation of the country. But I totally understand their right if you know, a strong suspicion was there to learn that there was no crime.
The idea of compromise is interesting here, because I want to come back in that way to the Steinmeier formula. One of the issues with the Steinmeier formula is how it is perceived by the Ukrainian population, or at least in Kyiv and some other cities. You've seen protests, you've seen people having banners saying no surrender. Do you think that this need for compromise is, as some experts, as some critics of this move said, a disguised surrender?
Well, I think that in general, Ukrainian nation is pretty politically hot. That's why it's easier to bring people to the streets, and the issue by itself is extremely important. So obviously there is a certain part of population that would object to the peace process. And it's quite natural and understandable. It's a very painful issue, and a lot of families have lost their relatives during the war. But it doesn't mean that the majority of the nation actually stands on the same position as those that were expressed on the streets of Kyiv. Plus, additionally, obviously, there is a very tough political struggle within the country. So there are political forces which confront President Zelensky, and they also, of course, are fueling up the process that were taking place. It's normal. That's what democracy is all about. But that's also what we were discussing in the past in this studio and in other programs, that we really, I think, we need to develop a comprehensive peace plan, and when it's ready, to present it to the nation and maybe organize a public referendum so that there would be no doubts in future whether the nation supports such a plan or not. And if nation does, you can protest, you cannot protest, but the majority have spoken.
So basically, democracy at work. Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio to talk about all this issue.
Thanks.
There was Ilya Ponomarev, former Russian MP. Thank you for watching the program, and stay tuned for the rest.